It's said that some 30% of the average human life is spent at work. That is a lot of life and a lot of work. But you know what's scarier than that? Horror films that are set in the workplace. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 best workplace horror movies. Number 10, The Belco Experiment. Now be honest, we've all worked in utter hellscapes before, right? And from time to time have possibly considered, murdering our colleagues from time to time? No, just me? Okay, probably should keep that to myself. Well, Greg McLean's horror movie allows its characters to indulge in just that, whether they like it or not. Workers at the Belco Institute, a corporate office in Colombia, are locked in and trapped with a remote voice commanding them that people start killing their co-workers. With explosive microchips implanted in their heads, it's essentially battle royale crossed with The Office. As the workers are forced to fight for their lives, level-headed Mike finds himself fending off against increasingly desperate colleagues, including Office Space and Scrub star John C. McGinley. This mean and brutal action horror film combines workplace drama with violent action and intense gore, culminating in a guy being bashed to death with a tape dispenser. The most terrifying thing, though, about this film is just how plausible the whole thing could be. Number 9, Mayhem. The Office flu. Bad enough when it's just the sniffles and a sore throat, but even worse when it's a dangerous virus which causes one to act out in the very worst ways. When such an infection infests a corporate law office, attorney Derek catches the bug. Although he has enough self-control to not break out murdering everyone in sight, the same can't be said for his co-workers. Teaming up with the spunky Melanie, the pair attempt to just survive the day while also indulging in a little of their most violent impulses. Hot on the trail of the Belco Experiment, this comedy horror film goes for fun over scares, allowing its Walking Dead star to cut loose and just enjoy himself. Pencil pushers as zombies is not a new metaphor, but no one expected director Joe Lynch to go for the very human, rage-infected kind. Ultimately, Mayhem does exactly what it says on the tin. Number 8, Severance. Now, this is a workplace horror movie without the workplace, as Christopher Smith's Severance follows a group of co-workers on a company retreat in Hungary. Stumbling onto the stomping grounds of Russian war criminals, the gang are soon enough attacked by heavily armed mercenaries. Stoner Steve and workplace crush Maggie fight for their very survival, stumbling over the increasingly dead bodies of their more hapless colleagues, making for one of the most underrated British horror comedies. It does an excellent job of balancing its dark humour with some truly vicious kills and spills. For example, company nerd Gordon loses his leg to a bear trap during a game of paintball. Jill is burned to death. The boss steps on a landmine. Harris is beheaded with a wink and a smile, which makes for the film's best running gag. Unlike a lot of horror comedies, this one is not afraid to get nasty, which makes it one of the most effective that you'll ever see. In retrospect, maybe they should have just stayed in the office. Number 7, Alien. Never has space travel felt so, corporate. This is not Star Trek, this is Ridley Scott's sci-fi classic, which basically reimagines astronauts as a crew of interstellar space truckers. Awakened from hypersleep by a mysterious distress call, Dallas and his crew rush to answer, and among said crew, it's the iconic Ellen Ripley, shown here to be little more than a grunt with a job to do, and that job is complicated by the presence of a vicious xenomorph on their ship, tearing the crew apart with terrifying ease. Ripley and Dallas are good to kill the thing, but Android Ash, he's got other intentions. The eponymous alien might be the franchise's most persistent threat, but Ripley and Ash's corporate overlords represent something far more insidious and far more human. The Weyland-Yutani Corporation looms heavily over all of the Alien films, and their obsession with monetizing the creatures causes nothing but death and further destruction. But no other film in the series has a handle on workplace mundanity like Scott's Alien. The spaceship is clunky and industrial, the crew genuine blue-collar workers who are underpaid and overworked. Truly, in Office Space, no one can hear you scream. Number 6, Final Destination 5. Like Severance, this Final Destination sequel tells the story of a work outing gone horribly wrong. Unlike Severance, however, Sam and his colleagues never even reach their final destination before they start dying. The bridge carrying them all collapses and sends the group tumbling to their deaths, or at least that's what happens in Sam's big premonition. Averting the disaster, Sam saves himself and his colleagues, only for death to start picking them off in the days and weeks that follow. Following a group of office stiffs and blue-collar workers instead of the usual college kids, Stephen Quayle's sequel makes the most of its corporate setting. There's even a warehouse downstairs where the film manages to notch up one of its gnarliest kills. And to add to the corporate vibe, their mean-spirited boss Dennis gets to die horribly not once, but twice, in the aforementioned gnarliest kill. Number 5. Intruder. Retail is a horrible enough experience as it is, so the last thing that anybody needs is a deranged murderer trying to slaughter you as you're aiming to get some work done. Working the overnight shift in a supermarket, a crew of workers are quietly restocking the shelves in preparation for the next day, but unbeknownst to Linda and her colleagues, there's a murderer in their midst who's stalking the aisles. This supermarket slasher film is one of the great underrated horror movies of the late 80s. Directed by the co-creator of The Evil Dead and with small roles for both Ted Raimi and Bruce Campbell, it was perhaps overlooked for not being The Evil Dead, but then again, what actually is? Instead, Intruder is its own thing, a gory, lurid psycho thriller with a good story and a solid kill sequence. There are all too few horror films that are set in grocery stores or retail, but of them, Intruder is the very best. Number 4. Day of the Dead. Self-isolation and quarantine were, well, pretty bad if you ask me, but imagine how much worse things could have been if you were trapped with your awful colleagues and your co-workers. Such is the scenario faced by scientist Sarah in George Romero's Day of the Dead. Trapped in an underground bunker with her fellow scientists and a team of twitchy military men, Sarah is in for the long haul. Above ground though, while the apocalypse is in full swing. With tensions rising, Sarah finds herself caught between the military and her mad scientist boss. By comparison, trained zombie Bub seems positively sedate. This, the third film in Romero's Living Dead trilogy, is the darkest and most nihilistic of the three. Not only is it a great zombie film, but it also perfectly encapsulates the experience of being trapped in a toxic work environment with a bunch of arseholes. Thankfully, Sarah does manage to get herself out there, flying off into the sunset with her two most chill colleagues, so maybe there's hope for us all yet. Number 3. Vampire's Kiss. Now, vampires are the worst, but bosses? Even worse. When he's bitten by a woman, publishing executive Peter begins to undergo a series of bizarre changes, exhibiting erratic behavior and becoming increasingly unhinged. Convinced that he's been bitten by a vampire, Peter does what all bad bosses do, and that's take his suffering out on his poor employees. Now, don't let the title fool you, there's no actual real vampires in Robert Bierman's black horror comedy, and there's no supernatural work at play here other than the story of a man losing his mind. But that man just happens to be played by late 80s era Nicolas Cage, and thus this propels the film into internet infamy. As Peter tortures his long-suffering secretary with unpredictable violent outbursts and humiliating verbal beatdowns, the film gives a great representation of life as an office underling, trapped at the whim and mercy of a deluded tyrant, and in this case, it's also one who thinks he's turning into a vampire. Number 2. The Lighthouse. As most people with day jobs will know, it's hard to keep your distance from an annoying colleague when you have to work together all day, every day. So learns Winslow, lighthouse keeper and assistant to the gruff and grizzled Thomas. Between the menial and heavy workload and the irritable old man constantly farting up a storm, it's not long before the younger man grows resentful. This soon turns into mania and delusion as the pair get drunker and more isolated. The pair are bound for conflict, and that is well before they start drinking kerosene. Robert Eggers' surrealist gothic horror film, or however you want to describe this weird thing, is a truly disturbing work of psychological terror. As both men begin to unravel, Thomas grows ever more belligerent and irritating. Well, we've all been there. It's no wonder that he finally snaps and attacks Thomas, burying him alive in front of the titular lighthouse, which, now with his colleague dead, he gets to keep all to himself. At least he gets some peace and quiet, right? And number 1, The Shining. Like many of us these days, Jack Torrance is a victim of the gig economy. This former teacher is forced to take on a menial caretaker job at a remote hotel in the mountains. At the same time, Jack is also an aspiring writer, using the isolation and low workload to try and get some writing done, both of which would be a lot easier if it wasn't for the presence of his family and a hotel full of malicious ghosts. Released in 1980, this adaptation of Stephen King's classic novel is now a powerful depiction of what it's like to work from home. Surrounded by constant distractions, it's literally only a couple of Zoom calls away from accurately portraying life as it was in 2020. Due to a combination of alcoholism, ghosts, and his own short temper, it's not long before Jack begins losing his mind, coming after his own wife and kid with an axe, and delivering one of the most iconic movie lines ever. With this in mind, we can't really judge Jack too harshly for his actions, right? After all, he just wanted to get some work done. No? Am I alone in this? Fair enough. Yeah, he's horrible.